1 month on from Cities Skylines 2's initial release, and it would be fair to say it's been a mixture of the good, the bad, and most certainly the ugly, with this graph player count between Cities 1 and Cities 2 demonstrating just that. We'll cover all three, but mainly we're going to reflect on how Cities 2 has landed and why it's been a little bit of a messy landing. So sit back and relax, and let's jump straight into the video. With time cards below, and in fairness to what I do think are some fairly solid bones in the structure, the identity of Cities Skylines 2, we'll start with the good. Cities has received 4 patches since launch. In that 1 month, there has been a patch a week, and while the developers, Colossal Order, have signaled that they won't be keeping up with that frequency now moving forward, slowing down instead to focus on deeper, more complicated issues like performance, like the ongoing bugs. We'll talk more about that a little later though. The 4 patches themselves were all fairly small, as you can imagine, pumping out one a week. They're not going to be major updates, and they certainly were not that, but they did aim to fix a few different bugs, glitches, errors with the game, and errors in the simulation, another really critical sticking point. They haven't really been able to tackle much in the way of performance. However, those 4 patches, alongside what I have to give them credit for has been a fairly responsive and engaged reflex from the developers, might be the best way to put it. Whether it's on Paradox forums or a little bit more broadly, it's clear that they are listening, and I want to give them credit for that, because again, I think this game has solid foundations. It's just flawed with a whole load of issues, and it's also clear to me that Colossal Order have been working fairly hard at it. That being said, this video is obviously not about shilling Colossal Order or Cities Skylines 2. It's about reflecting on how this game has done. And that is probably the end of the good section, other than the thing that I've sort of hinted at already, and that's that the foundations here are pretty solid. The road tools, for example, are great. It's really fun to build a city if your PC can handle the game, and if you look around the internet, you'll also find a lot of good stuff, a lot of positivity. You'll certainly see a lot of creators making videos about Cities Skylines, and you'll rarely see them just completely lash out and say it's a terrible game. In fact, for the most part, you're probably looking at stuff like building challenges, the most efficient city, the largest city, I did this challenge, I did that, this, that, and the other. And that's great, because clearly there are people who are enjoying this game, and I think it is a really enjoyable game when it works. And that's probably a pretty good transition into the second part of this video, the bad. Almost as bad as me accidentally jumping into this video to remind you to subscribe to help us reach that 6-figure goal. Sorry, I'm desperate. The big one when it comes to bad is performance, and we've talked about this, I feel like, again and again. Their intention to fix performance issues and our difficulty to get the game to run. Not for everybody, I have to admit. I do see many comments, people saying, I don't know what you're talking about, runs perfectly fine for me, I'm having a great time. And obviously, as you can see by this footage that I've captured, in this city that I've built, I can play it. So fundamentally it works, but does it? Well, as we found out from testing it on a 4090, one of the latest Intel processors, 64 gigabytes of RAM on my system, it does struggle. And while the performance target from Colossal Order may only be 30 frames per second, which is perhaps fair and reasonable for a city builder like this, rather than a fast-paced shooter, it doesn't even deliver that for most players. And if you can't play the game, how could you ever reflect on it positively? This, for me, is the fundamental issue, that performance problem. When you move past that issue, maybe you have a better system, maybe you just happen to be fairly well optimized, or maybe you're watching this video a couple of months in the future, where more patches have came out and performance is less of a problem, you then run into the bug fixes. Or more appropriately, the bugs that haven't been fixed. And there are all kinds of issues, from differences between left-hand and right-hand traffic, from some of the many lighting issues that might cause buildings to light up and go dim, and light up and go dim, or maybe just sort of not really light up properly at all. And that's really just scratching the surface. I'm sure you can think of many other things. Think about garbage not working properly. Mail not being sorted, the city service basically not functioning at all. Or those rumors which turned out to be true, but maybe just misinterpreted a little bit, that the entire simulation in this game is false. The answer to that rumor? The entire simulation isn't false. They haven't intended to trick you. It's not like sort of a facade and, haha, we tricked you. It's just for show. It's more that it's broken, right? It goes back to those bugs again, those errors in the game, those things that just aren't working properly. Again, garbage, mailing, the list goes on and on. And that, once you get past the performance hurdle, which if you've successfully gallivanted over the top of, you'll run into. And you'll run into quite a few of them. Are they game-breaking? Not necessarily. However, it is meant to be a city simulator, not just a city painter. You're not just jumping in to paint a skyline, you actually want to kind of have an economy that's functioning, traffic that makes sense, services that are being distributed in the way that you intend them to be, and a city economy that's actually functioning properly too, which at the moment, it still is not. There are still glaring issues, like with resource production, resource exports, for example, just kind of not really working all that well. And that leads to the impression that the simulation has been faked. It hasn't been faked. Perhaps there's another F word for what it's been. Fudged a little bit, right? There are some errors to fix, some bugs to iron out, and that is the second sticking point in this bad section. The final one, perhaps the lesser of the three evils, unless you're playing on console, that's delays. Obviously, the console version's delayed by around 6 months after the PC version. You're likely looking at something like May of next year before you can get your grubby little hands around your controller to play Cities Skylines 2 on your console. And of course, the delays didn't stop there. We also heard about delays recently to the expanded, the Ultimate Edition, the expansion pass for this game, basically DLC delayed by roughly 3 months. And of course, the editor, the modding tools, not there either. And when you package all of these things together, you end up with quite a lot of frustration and disappointment, I think, on behalf of the community, and that's reflected, of course, in the very mixed reviews for Cities Skylines 2. It doesn't really matter where you look, even if you look at the sort of like quote-unquote proper critics who tend to review these things perhaps a little bit more favorably than me, and perhaps a lot more favorably than some other people on the internet, you'll still find negative reviews, or at the very least mixed. It is a mixed bag, and there are many issues here still to be fixed in Cities Skylines 2. It is broadly still, I believe, an early access game, or at least it perhaps could or maybe even should have had that label initially. And now we move on to the final section, the ugly, where really here, of course, we could talk about some of the bad, right? What's the difference between the bad and the ugly? Well, you know, there's a little bit of finessing there probably, but I think there is one thing that stands out more than anything else. It's not that issues are bad, it's the ugliness that comes through. And I'm not talking about people's individual behaviors or responses, I'm talking about the player count in particular. As I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, there are some problems where Cities 1 is overtaking Cities 2. Let's take a look firstly though, before we get too ahead of ourselves, at Cities 2. This is a look at the game's first month, minus the first couple of days, where it did peak up over 100,000 players at one point. But you can see early on, in late October, there are these peaks and troughs up to around 70, 75,000, down much lower than that, around 30. And then as we move through into November, you just see more and more of a gradual decline in the number of people who are playing Cities Skylines 2, and it kind of fluctuates, of course, based on the time of day, time zone, blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, you can see it's coming down and down and down, cracking below 10,000 active players, actually, for the last couple of days. And if you're watching this video in the future, which hopefully you are, although realistically probably most people will watch it in like the first day or two, then maybe these numbers from back in October 30 will seem like a pipe dream. If we move through to the more ugly comparison, here's a graph from May through November 2023, and also the numbers are summed up down the bottom as well. But if we start with the graph, you can see obviously for the most part it's just Cities Skylines 1, trucking along pretty happily, maybe 27, 28, 29,000-ish players, peaking a little bit for Cities 2 and then dropping off down to 20,000 average across a fortnight this is, remember. Cities 2 there you can see surging in its first fortnight at 104,000 players at its peak, and then dropping down very quickly, losing around 25,000 to potentially 30,000 players per fortnightly period. There have only been 3 that have been measured, of course, so this is a relatively limited sample, and it is, of course, only measuring Steam players. There may or may not be other ways to play the game. There may or may not be other players not included. If we zoom in a little bit though and take a look at this final chart, not to lecture you too much, this is a look at basically just the last week at the time of recording, or a middle week in November if you're watching in the future. And the really ugly thing here for Cities 2 is right at the end here. Look at how close it gets to Cities 1. I predict, because it's clearly the trend, that if nothing changes quickly with Cities Skylines 2, Cities 1 may very well overtake it. Cities 1 is cheaper, much more accessible, and it works. So why wouldn't it overtake Cities 2, given everything that we've discussed about Cities 2 in this video? I think it makes sense, at least in the short to medium term, though in the long run, I do still think that Cities Skylines 2 will be the definitive city builder. It's just gonna take some dang time. And that brings us to the end of this video, and actually a fairly good point to conclude my future sort of predictions, if you will, for Cities 2. I think that a lot of you will probably agree, but I'm keen on your thoughts on anything and everything we've discussed in this video, so please let me know. And thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.